Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And welcome back, everyone. We're talking to this gentleman today. Learned so much about what he does. And it's not something that we usually talk about. Funerals. Not the happiest subject, but you know what? It is the reality in our lives. And he's the president and owner of Martin A. Gleason Funeral Homes. They're located in the New York metro area, right around the Queens area. And he's back with us. We're going to talk about identification of your loved ones. John Golden is here on the program. Hey, John, how you doing?
Good. Good afternoon, Steve.
Wonderful to have you back here and learned a lot so far. And yes, sometimes challenging to talk about this subject, but it's not something you often can Google and get details on, especially a lot of the details. And especially, if you're faced in a situation with a loved one maybe imminently passing or has passed unexpectedly, now you have to jump into this. Now, we talked about pre-planning in the past and how important that is. Correct ID is what we're talking about today. Specifically, what does that entail?
Well, it's very important to make sure there's correct identification of a loved one. For example, the events of 9/11 showed the importance of identifying the remains of every loved one that got killed as a result of the terrorist act. The medical examiner's office has worked extremely hard for years since 9/11 to assure the proper identification of all who got killed in 9/11 by terrorists. Currently there's no law in New York to identify human remains. Furthermore, there's no requirement for an in-person funeral home verification of remains. Recently on Long Island, the family's loved one was shipped in from another state, and unfortunately, no identification was done at the funeral home in New York to verify the identity of the deceased. There was a mix-up, and there is an ongoing lawsuit in this matter. They buried the misidentified body in somebody else's grave. It's my belief that the standards for funeral service will be raised by enacting such a law. Anytime a job that becomes the responsibility of a member of our esteemed profession is legally required, it strengthens the license of a funeral director. We lived in a fast-paced, ease of convenience. Consumers, DoorDash and Uber Eats, they opt for drive-through and Amazon same-day or next-day deliveries. Convenience and celebrity reign supreme. And that may be well and good when it comes to your burger order or your book order, but not for your loved one's final rest. We always require the identification of anybody that is buried or cremated through our funeral home. And I remember one time we had a wake on and the family came out and they said, "That's not our loved one." So, of course, I went right downstairs and I said, "Is it all right if I open the foot end of the casket to look at the toe tag?" And the tag, the hospital had the correct name and toe tag on it. And I showed the family the toe tag. And then I said, "Well, did the deceased have any tattoos or anything?" They said, "Oh, yes." So we rolled up the sleeve, and under that was a tattoo. And they said, "Oh, that is him then." And then they finally said, "Well, we haven't seen him in 25 years. Wow. But, if that wasn't done in person and they just, looked at a picture, they would say that's not him, when in fact it was.
Sure.
And, it pays to take time and make sure the identification is done. At the city medical examiner's office, they're very careful, and they email a photo of the deceased to the funeral home. And in those cases, the form must be signed by the next of kin, witnessed, and in addition to the funeral director has to sign that they witnessed that the identification was made and it's correct. And the medical examiner's office has set the standard to prevent lawsuits and litigation in court. In my opinion, it behooves a funeral home to endorse in-person funeral home verification of remains. I remember going over to transfer the highest ranking officer of the fire department who was killed in 9/11. And I drove over in the hearse and the LIE, and it was deserted except for like one or two construction vehicles and the hearse. When I arrived at the medical examiner office that very night of 9/11, even with all the events of the day and the many deceased at the medical examiner's office, they did a professional job of releasing the correct deceased to the funeral homes. You know, we had deceased released to us for over 2 years, even 2 years later, because they had to do DNA to verify the identification. And this was painstakingly done by the medical examiner office, and very well done, I might add. I'm reminded of a bumper sticker that read, "There is never time to do it right the first time, but always time to do it twice." And when you're doing it twice, it can come with a spotlight, and a lot of that attention to your funeral home for all the wrong reasons. Let's ensure we always get it right the first time going forward by enacting in-person funeral home verification of remains.
You're bringing, sensitive subject here, but bringing a lot of light to it in that there are many chains of command, if you will, along the way, depending on the situation. If it was an accident, car accident, whatever it might be, you're dealing, potentially with the hospital, then the medical examiner, then the funeral home, all along the way to make sure the identification is correct. Accidents do happen. Mistakes are made. And I'm not putting blame on anybody here.
No.
But ultimately, I guess it does come down to the family along the way, as challenging as it is to make the identification. And that's, I guess, the point that we're making here today.
Yes. And I mean, sometimes it doesn't have to be the immediate next of kin. Like if there's a wife, the children could do the identification if the wife wasn't up to it. But somebody in the family should do an identification.
Are there legal guidelines with that? Let's just say the family is not at the moment where they're comfortable to do that. Can a close family friend, almost like family I'm talking about here, can they be designated, or does it have to be the family to make the ID?
Well, if the family designates them to make the identification, they can.
Okay.
Because it's better to have somebody make the identification than nobody.
Sure.
And, if that's the only, sometimes somebody's in a wheelchair, they can't get out of the house.
Sure.
So, of course, that's understandable that somebody else will do the identification. And, especially if you're shipping somebody to Italy or Ireland, you want to make sure before the shipment that the family or a friend identifies the deceased before going overseas. And, it's important to do.
That brings up, another thought here in terms of transportation of a loved one. Now, somebody may have passed in another state and then has to be transported to another state. What's the protocol for that? And these are the questions that nobody knows. I don't even know how you find the answer to that. But can you walk us through that?
Sure. Well, say if the death occurs in Florida, the family would call us or another funeral home, and we would get their permission to take their loved one into our care and have embalming performed. We would call, we're not licensed in Florida, but we have affiliates in Florida we call, and they would arrange for the local transfer and the embalming, and then they would ship the deceased up to us into either LaGuardia or JFK. We would give all the information for the death certificate to the Florida funeral home. They would file the permit for the funeral in Florida because that's the place of death. And then we would meet the deceased at the airport, take them into our care, and then arrange for the service and the burial or cremation. And again, if it was going directly to a cemetery, we would require that the family do an identification before the burial or the cremation. And or if we were shipping somebody to Florida, we would get all the information in New York. We would file the burial permit with the City of New York Health Department on Work Street electronically, and then we would ship the deceased to the receiving funeral director in Florida, and they would take over from there once it arrives, the deceased arrives in Florida. But this can be done throughout the United States.
Sure.
Families, if they're not having any visiting in other states, they just have to remember to call us first, and then we would take care of everything for them.
Are there protocols for the identification along the way?
Well, normally, a funeral home, like say if the death occurs in Florida, they more than likely would require somebody in the family to identify the deceased before being shipped to New York. And then when the deceased arrives in New York, we would require somebody to identify the deceased, either at the wake or definitely before the burial or cremation. And at the hospital, they're very careful of putting tags on the deceased on the wrist, on the foot, and that's very important because sometimes you get two similar names, and you have to be, you could get John Smith and James Smith, and you have to be careful that the right Mr. Smith is in your care.
Sure. You must have seen all different scenarios in your career, John.
Yes, we've had once or twice we've gone to a hospital. I know a couple of years ago, one of our employees' father-in-law died, and when he went to the hospital, he just happened to open up the face to see, and it wasn't his father-in-law. They had made a mistake, so they corrected it right there. They luckily he knew his father-in-law, and they corrected it. And there was the mistakes happen, unfortunately, but this one was one that was corrected, and no harm was done.
Right. Yeah. Again, accidents are going to happen. Mistakes are going to be made. It happens. So
right.
Just taking those steps to make sure that the correct identification is there. What other things should we be mindful of along those lines after there is a passing and your loved one is in the care of, let's say, the hospital, or I guess maybe even the medical examiner?
Yeah, the medical examiner has a very good system. They, of course, require a licensed funeral director to come to the medical examiner's office to make the transfer. We have to give them, an affidavit that shows the name of the deceased and the next of kin, their information. And then they release to us, and we bring the deceased loved one back to the funeral home. And of course, it's labeled at all times, and we don't remove the labels, and we place the deceased. We dress the deceased, and then we place the deceased in the casket and into the viewing room. So, everything is labeled at all times, and we're as careful as possible.
There's in the last number of years, the trend has been more cremations, but that doesn't mean that you can't have an actual service with a casket, correct?
Correct. You can have a wake with a casket. It has to be a wood casket because the crematories won't take a metal casket. You can have a wake. You can have a service at the funeral home, or you can have a wake and a service at a church, and then have the cremation after that. And the family has an option of going to the crematory or not going to the crematory. If the family's not going to go to the crematory and there's a church service, what we do after the church services, we pick flowers, one for each person. We open the back door of the hearse, and after the mass, instead of going to the cemetery, they place the flower in the hearse with their loved one, and then we go ahead on our own to the crematory. Or if the family wants to follow us to the crematory, sometimes they hire a limousine to follow the hearse over to the crematory. They have a chapel at the crematory. The director or the priest or rabbi would say a few words. And then, if they want to witness the cremation, they can, or they could just leave after the chapel service. They have that option.
What do you hear from people that gravitate toward cremation? There's all different reasons, but it's gotten more popular. Cost is maybe probably one of those. But what do you hear typically from people?
Yeah, a lot of times we hear that was the deceased wish to be cremated, and sometimes they don't have a grave, and and they feel that the cremation is the way they want to have a funeral, and it's more and more accepted. Like years ago, a Catholic church didn't allow cremation, but now they do. And since then, it has increased cremation rates quite a bit. The Greek church still doesn't allow cremation. If you're going to have a church service, you have to have a burial. They still believe not in cremation. There's quite a bit of, like, a veteran can be buried in the military cemetery. He gets the grave for no charge, the headstone, a concrete liner, and they save a spot for his spouse also. And it's all free of charge because of the service that he put in the military.
And that, even if that service person is cremated, the remains can be placed in the grave.
Yes, it can be placed. They have graves in the ground, and they also have columbariums in the wall where they can put the urn in the wall. Long Island National and Pine Lawn, or Calverton and out by Riverhead.
Great point that you bring up, that more faiths are okay with cremation now. I totally forgot about that. My mind is more of a in terms of cost, but that's now that has changed in recent years. That makes sense now. Why some more gravitate toward cremation?
Yes, because years ago the Catholic Church said no, and no Catholic, hardly any Catholic would be cremated.
Sure.
But now it's, I would say, probably maybe 40-50% of Catholics get cremated now. And
And for that, there's you call upon, all three locations of your funeral home call upon a crematory to take care of that. Is that correct?
Yeah, in other words, we would take the deceased to the crematory. There's two crematories in Queens. One is Fresh Pond Crematory in Middle Village, and one is All Souls Crematory in Astoria. And they very reliable, and because they have to be careful to give us the right cremains back, and
sure,
they have their procedures, and it's the Fresh Pond's been in business over 100 years and has a very good reputation, and All Souls also has a reputation.
And I believe a lot of people don't realize that with the cremains, if you will, that of course you can have an urn, but the cremated remains can also be given to loved ones in mementos. There's all different types.
Right. Yes, there's jewelry now. There's keepsake jewelry. You could send cremains in space now. They have that, or in the reefs in the ocean. They can bury them. They can take them home. Some urns look like a clock, and you wouldn't even know it's an urn. You could put it on the mantle at home, and the only thing is the Catholic Church believes eventually all the cremains should be either buried in a grave or in a niche, as a sacred.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have a challenging position there, John, because you've got your finger on the pulse of all different religions, all different regulations, legalities, all of that, and you have to blend that through all different people and emotion that you're dealing with the people that the loved ones that you work with. I give you much respect. I really, really do.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, we do our best to ease the burden for the families, and we believe in prearrangement because the comment we always get, it's a difficult time as it is, but prearrangement has made it a little less difficult.
Sure. And there's financial advantages to that as well.
Yes, yeah.
Which we've talked about before.
Right.
But John, what are the three locations for the funeral homes?
There's one in Flushing, 149th Place in Northern Boulevard, one in Bell Boulevard and Bayside, and there's one in 150th Street in Whitestone. And all of them have parking lots, which helps in Queens.
It helps anywhere.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
You have people coming from out of town, and you want to accommodate them and make it as comfortable as possible. Final question here. I don't know if I ever asked you this, John. How long have you been doing this?
I've been licensed since 1979. I got my license in 1979. Yeah.
Wow.
So I've been working. Well, when I was in college, I got my BA in economics from York College, and when I started college in 1972, I was working part-time with a funeral home. So really, since 1972, as a college freshman, I was working the door at night at a funeral home.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
Wow. The number of families that you've helped support, the tears that you may have seen and help turn those tears around to some celebration, positivity of somebody's life, all of that. Many props and much respect for what you do.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah. They say that, we have a purpose in life.
Yeah.
It goes without saying, you found your purpose a long time ago. And for that, we thank you. If somebody wants to find you online, what's the best way?
GleasonFH at AOL.com.
Gotcha. Well, that's email. If somebody wants to find you, it's GleasonFuneral.com. Is that right?
Gleason. The website is www.gleasonsfuneral.com, and the email is GleasonFH at AOL.com.
Gotcha. Yeah, and the website, there is an S there, GleasonsFuneral.com. You said it. I'm bringing it back up again.
Okay,
yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve.
We'll be right back. Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Hey, Dad, how do airplanes fly? What's in this box? Can I touch this? Where does sand come from? Is this tree good for climbing? What happens if I mix these two things together? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Storing your guns securely is the best way to prevent family fire, including unintentional shootings. For more information on safe gun storage and ways to keep your family safe, visit endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org.
What do we keep in the attic? What's this thing called? Can I ride my bike backwards?
Like I said, kids are curious. It's up to us to keep them safe. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.